Happy Tuesday to one and everyone. It is Tuesday, right? It is Tuesday. Quarantine. I don't know what day of the week it is. It's Tuesday. It's definitely Tuesday in May. Some Tuesday in May. Also the hit of my next single. Hope everyone's having a great day. I have like kind of crazy hair going on. I've decided to embrace this weird like grow out stage of my hair and just kind of like embrace it in sort of like a Edie Sedgwick way or something. Just fell down a rabbit hole about her life the other day. So I'm like, well, I guess I could just be like, it's an Edie Sedgwick thing. All I need to do is bleach it, which I've been thinking about doing. I need to ask a stylist friend of mine who always bleaches her own hair if I could do it. I'm tempted to bleach it again. Could be pretty fun. Thoughts. Anyways, back to War and Peace, classic literature. It's quarantine story time with some more War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy. Thank you again for everyone who's here and who's tuning in for the first time, whatever. There's a War and Peace playlist with all the readings so far up. Because today we're starting in Volume 1, Part 2. We'll be doing sections 18, 19, and 20 today. So if you missed some, feel free to go back to the playlist and pick up any of the other previous read segments that you may need to review or you want to review. I have the live chat going, so if you guys have any questions or comments, pop them there. I'll try to address them as I read. Hey to people on the chat. What else? So we're in the war section of War and Peace, and there was a lot of setup. Prince Andrei was kind of riding around the encampment of the vanguard forces of the Russian army that are trying to hold off the French forces for the rest of the Russian army to get in place so that hopefully they aren't completely destroyed. And so he's kind of riding around, scoping it out. Prince Bagration appears to be the leader of that, though it kind of ended last time with a kind of funny note that he sort of had, as they're getting fired upon, as the French start firing on them, he kind of shows up and is kind of set in some directions, but most people are kind of just doing, most people are just sort of doing the, whatever their like immediate captains are saying. And some of them like are coming back to him to confer, and he's just sort of like encouraging everyone along, but he's also a very sort of like chill guy. He seems always, I guess he kind of just seems like very like, yes, this is what I expected to happen. Yes. So we'll jump back in there, and it looks like the French forces are starting to come around. I think they said the right flank. So they're completely outnumbered, so they're going to quickly surround them. But it looks like the right side is already starting to fall back, and could be a problem. Can I read the English translation of the French, please? Yeah, I try to whenever there's like big sections. If it's just a few, like if it's just a line or two, or like just a sentence, I will kind of just leave it off just so we can kind of keep the pace. And I also think there's something really great about sort of the original feel of how the book would have been, as opposed to just, it's all one language. It was written all in one language. It was written in multiple languages. As we've mentioned, it was written in Russian, but there's like French thrown in because French was the language of the court and of diplomacy during the time. And also there's like some German phrases or some, German words or names. And there was even that one like Italian phrase out of nowhere. So never know where Tolstoy is going to go. And just to kind of sort of try to give us a little bit of the original intention. I kind of like to leave some of that in there. If there's big segments, I will definitely read the English. Thank you for mentioning that. I'll just say, hey, I try to make note that I'm choosing to read the translated bit so that we can all understand what's happening. Like Bonaparte's writing a letter in French. Well, we kind of need to know the content. But if we miss a sentence here or there, I think that kind of adds something to the way it was written, and that maybe a lot of people, if the average person who got this in a newspaper, because it was originally part of a serial, if the average person didn't speak French, they would have had the same trouble as you and I. So I think there's something nice about that. I think it's also it's a good reminder that whatever language you speak or I speak or this writer speaks is not the language of the whole world. So it's always nice to have a reminder that there's lots of languages in the world, and our own understanding of something is not the only one, or exists within a lot of other understandings. So I think that's like a nice little philosophical touch of mine, philosophical touch of Tolstoy's, that I just try to stay as true to as possible as I stumble through. And like I said, I am kind of just reading this for the first time with you, so hold on to your hats, ladies and gentlemen. It could be a bumpy ride, but I'm hoping you'll enjoy it as much as I enjoy it in the moment, and you will. So yeah, thanks. Thank you all. All right. Without further ado, let us get into section 18. Prince Bagration, having ridden to the highest point on our right flank, started down to where the rolling gunfire could be heard, and nothing could be seen through the powder smoke. The further they descended into the hollow, the less they could see, but the more they could sense the nearness of the actual battlefield. They began to meet the wounded, one with a bloodied head, hatless, being dragged off under the arms by two soldiers. He gurgled and spat. The bullet seemed to have hit him in the mouth or the throat. Another came towards him, walking briskly by himself, without his musket, groaning loudly and waving his arms from the fresh pain, while blood poured over his greatcoat, as if from a flask. His face showed more fear than suffering. He had been wounded a moment before. Crossing the road, they began a steep descent, and on the slope they saw several men who were lying down. They met a crowd of soldiers, some of whom were not wounded. The soldiers were walking up the hill, breathing heavily, and through the smoke they saw the general, were talking loudly and waving their arms. Ahead in the smoke, lines of gray greatcoats could now be seen, and an officer, catching sight of Bagration, ran shouting after the soldiers walking in a crowd, demanding that they turn back. Bagration rode up to the lines, along which there were here and there a rapid crackle of gunfire, drowning out talk and shouts of command. The air was completely saturated with powder smoke. The soldier's face was all smudged with powder and animated. Some tamped down the ramrods, others primed the pans and took shots from their pouches. Still others fired, but who they were firing at could not be seen owing to the smoke, which there was no wind to scatter. Pleasant buzzing and whistling noises were heard rather often. What's that? Thought Prince Andrei, riding up to the crowd of soldiers. It can't be a line because they're in a bunch. It can't be an attack because they're not moving. It can't be a square, they're not standing right. A lean, weak-looking old man, a regimental commander, with a pleasant smile, with eyelids that more than half covered the old man's eyes, giving him a meek look, rode up to Prince Bagration and received him as a host receives a welcome guest. He reported to Prince Bagration that the French had mounted a cavalry attack against his regiment, and that, while the attack had been beaten off, the regiment had lost more than half its men. The regimental commander said that the attack had been beaten off, coming up with this military term to describe what had happened to his regiment. But in reality, he did not know himself what had happened in that half hour among the troops entrusted to him, and he could not say for certain whether the attack had been beaten off or his regiment had been crushed by the attack. At the start of the action, he knew only that cannonballs and shells began flying all over his regiment and hitting people. Then someone shouted, "Cavalry!" and our men began to fire. And they were still firing, no longer at the cavalry, who had disappeared, but at the French infantry who appeared in the hollow and were shooting at our men. Prince Bagration inclined his head as a sign that this was all exactly as he had wished and supposed. Turning to the adjutant, he ordered him to bring down from the hill 2 battalions of the 6th Chasseurs, which they had just ridden past. Prince Andrei was struck at the moment by the change that came over Prince Bagration's face. His face expressed the concentrated and happy resolve which occurs in a man who is about to throw himself into the water as hot as day and is making a running start. Neither the sleepy, lackluster eyes nor the falsely profound look was there. In his round, firm, hawk eyes looked straight ahead with rapture and with certain disdain, apparently not resting on anything, though his movements were as slow and measured as before. The regimental commander turned to Prince Bagration, entreating him to ride back because here it was too dangerous. "Please, Your Excellency, for God's sake," he repeated, glancing for confirmation at the officer of the suite, who turned away from him. "There, kindly see." He drew attention to the bullets that constantly shrieked, sang, and whistled around them. He spoke in the same tone of entreaty and reproach in which a carpenter speaks to a gentleman who has picked up an axe. "We're used to it, but you'll get blisters on your hands." He spoke as if he himself could not be killed by these bullets, and his half-closed eyes gave his words a still more persuasive expression. The staff officer joined in the regimental commander's admonitions, but Prince Bagration did not respond to them and merely ordered the men to stop shooting and line up so as to make room for the 2 expected battalions. While he was speaking, the rising wind, as with an invisible hand, drew from the right to the left the curtain of smoke that had concealed the hollow, and the hill opposite, with the French moving over it, opened out before them. All eyes were involuntarily turned to this French column that was moving towards them, winding down the terraces of the slope. The soldiers' shaggy heads were already visible. One could already distinguish the officers from the men. One could see their standard fluttering against its staff. "Nice marching," said someone in Bagration's suite. The head of the column was already down in the hollow. The confrontation was to take place on this side of the slope. The remnants of our regiment, which had been in action, lining up hastily, moved to the right. From behind them, scattering the stragglers, came the 2 battalions of the 6th Chasseurs in good order. They had not yet reached Bagration, but one could already hear the heavy, weighty tread of a whole mass of men marching in step. On the left flank, closest of all to Bagration, marched a company commander, a round-faced, stately man with a stupid, happy expression on his face, the same one who had come running from the lean-to. He was obviously thinking of nothing at that moment but the fine figure he would cut as he marched past his superior. With a parade-like self-satisfaction, he marched lightly on his muscular legs, as if floating, holding him straight without the least effort, and distinguishing himself by this lightness from the heavy tread of the soldiers who marched in step with him. He carried by his leg an unsheathed, thin, and narrow sword, a curved little sword, not resembling a weapon, and he lightly turned his whole strong body, looking now at his superior, now behind him, without slowing step. It seemed that all the forces of his soul were aimed at marching past his superior in the best possible way, and feeling that he was doing it well, he was happy. "Left, left, left," he seemed to be saying to himself at every other step, and the wall of soldiers' figures, burdened by packs and musket, with various stern faces, moved to this rhythm, as if each of those hundreds of soldiers was mentally saying, "Left, left, left," at every other step. A fat major, puffing and breaking the step, turned around a bush that was in his way. A lagging soldier, breathless with a frightened face because of his negligence, trotted to catch up with his company. A cannonball, pushing through the air, flew over the heads of Prince Bagration and his suite, and to the rhythm of "Left, left, left," struck the column. "Close ranks!" came the dashing voice of the company commander. The soldiers curved around something at the spot where the cannonball had landed, and a decorated old soldier, a sergeant on the flank, after lingering by the dead man, caught up with his line, skipped to change feet, fell into step, and looked back angrily. "Left, left, left," seemed to be heard through the ominous silence and the monotonous sound of feet simultaneously trampling the earth. "Bravo, lads," said Prince Bagration. "Glad to be of your ex," rolled through the ranks. A sullen soldier, marching on the left, turned his eyes to Bagration as he shouted with an expression that seemed to say, "We know it ourselves." Another, without looking, and as if fearing to be distracted, opened his mouth wide, shouted, and passed by. They were ordered to stop and remove their packs. Bagration stood around the ranks that had gone past him and dismounted. He handed the reins to a Cossack, removed and handed over his felt cloak, stretched his legs, and straightened his peaked cap. The head of the French column, with officers in the fore, appeared from the bottom of the hill. "God be with us," Bagration said in a firm, audible voice, turned for a moment to the front line, and swinging his arm slightly with the awkward gait of a cavalryman, as if working at it, he went forward over the uneven field. Prince Andrei felt that some invincible force was drawing him forward, and he experienced great happiness. The French were already close, walking beside Bagration. Prince Andrei could already make out clearly the bandoliers, the red epaulets, even the faces of the French. He clearly saw one old French officer walking uphill with difficulty on splayed feet in gaiters, holding on to bushes. Prince Bagration gave no new order and went on walking silently in front of the ranks. Suddenly, from among the French came the crack of a shot, a second, a third, and all across the disordered enemy ranks spread smoke and the crackle of gunfire. Several of our men fell, among them the round-faced officer who had marched so cheerfully and diligently. But just as the first shot rang out, Bagration turned and shouted, "Hurrah! Hurrah!" The prolonged cry spread through our line, and outstripping Prince Bagration and each other in a disorderly but cheerful and lively crowd, our men ran down the hill after the disordered French. Section 19. The attack of the 6th Chasseurs secured the retreat of the right flank. In the center, the action of Tushin's forgotten battery, which had managed to set fire to Schöngraben, stayed the movement of the French. The French were putting out the fire, which was spread by the wind, and allowed time for retreat. The retreat at the center across the ravine was hasty and noisy. However, the troops, in retreating, did not mix up their detachments, but the left flank, which was simultaneously being attacked and encircled by the superior forces of the French under Lannes, and which consisted of the Azovsky and Podolsky infantry regiments and the Pavlogradsky Hussar regiment, was in disorder. Bagration sent Zherkov to the general of the left flank with an order to retreat immediately. Zherkov, not taking his hand from his cap, briskly started his horse and galloped off, but as soon as he left Bagration, his strength failed him. An insurmountable fear came over him, and he was unable to go where there was danger. Having reached the troops of the left flank, he did not ride forward where the shooting was, but went looking for the general and the officers where they could not be, and therefore did not deliver the order. The command of the left flank belonged, in order of superiority, to the commander of the same regiment that had been presented to Kutuzov at Braunau, and in which Dolokhov served as a private. But the command of the extreme left flank was given to the commander of the Pavlogradsky regiment, in which Rostov served, owing to which a misunderstanding arose. The two officers were greatly vexed with each other, and at a time when action had long since started on the right flank, and the French had already begun their offensive, the two officers were taken up with an exchange which was the aim of insulting each other. The regiments, cavalry as well as infantry, were very little prepared for the forthcoming action. The men of the regiments, from private to general, were not expecting a battle, and were calmly occupied with peaceful matters, feeding horses in the cavalry, gathering firewood in the infantry. "If he, however, is senior to mine in the ranking," the German hussar colonel said, turning red and addressing an adjutant who had ridden up, "leave him to do as he wants. I, my hussars, cannot sacrifice. Bugler, sound the retreat." But things were becoming urgent. Cannonades and gunfire, blending, rumbled on the right and in the center, and the French greatcoats of Lannes riflemen were already passing the mill dam and forming up on this side, 2 musket shots away. The infantry general went up to a horse with his bouncing gait, mounted it, becoming very straight and tall, and rode to the Pavlogradsky commander. The regimental commanders came together with polite bows and concealed spite in their hearts. "Once again, Colonel," the general said, "I cannot, in any case, leave my men in the woods. I beg you, he repeated, "to take up your position and prepare for the attack." "And I beg you not to interfere in what is not your business," the colonel replied hotly. "If you were a cavalryman—" "I am not a cavalryman, colonel, but I am a Russian general, and if that is not known to you—" "Very much known, your excellency," the colonel suddenly cried, starting his horse and turning to reddish purple. "Be so kind, please, to go to the front, and you will see that this position is good for nothing. I do not want to destroy my regiment for your pleasure." "You forget yourself, colonel. I am not concerned with my own pleasure, and I will not allow you to say so." The general, accepting the colonel's invitation to a tournament of courage, drew himself up and, frowning, rode with him in the direction of the front, as if all their differences had to be resolved there, at the front, amidst the bullets. They reached the front, several bullets flew over them, and they stopped in silence. There was nothing to look at there, because even from the place where they had been standing before, it had been very clear that the cavalry could not operate in the bushes and ravines, and that the French were turning their left wing. The general and the colonel stared sternly and significantly at each other, like two cocks preparing to fight, vainly waiting for signs of cowardice. Both passed the examination. Since there was nothing to say, and neither of them wanted to give the other a pretext for claiming that he had been the first to run away from the bullets, they would have stood there for a long time, testing each other's courage, if at that moment, in the woods, almost behind them, there had not come a crackle of musket fire and a muffled, merging cry. The French had attacked the soldiers who had gone there for firewood. The hussars could no longer retreat together with the infantry. They were cut off from the path of retreat to the left by the French line. Now, however, inconvenient the terrain was, it was necessary to attack in order to cut a path for themselves. The squadron in which Rostov served had just had time to mount its horses when it was halted facing the enemy. Again, as on the Enns bridge, there was no one between the squadron and the enemy, and there lay between them, separating them, that same terrible line of the unknown and of fear, like the line separating the living from the dead. All the men sensed that line, and the question of whether they would or would not cross the line, and how they would cross it, troubled them. The colonel rode up to the front, angrily gave some order to the officers' questions, and like a man desperately insisting on having his own way, gave some order. No one said anything definite, but the rumor of an attack swept through the squadron. The command to form up was heard. Then sabers shrieked as they were drawn from their scabbards, and still no one moved. The troops of the left flank, both infantry and hussars, sensed that their superiors themselves did not know what to do, and the indecisiveness of the superiors communicated itself to the troops. Hurry up, thought Rostov, sensing that the time had come at last to experience the delight of an attack, of which he had heard so much from his hussar comrades. "God be with us, lads," Denisov's voice rang out. "At the Grot march!" The croups of the horses in the front row moved. Little Rook pulled at the reins and started off himself. To the right, Rostov saw the first rows of his hussars, and still further ahead he could see a dark strip, which he could not make out but thought to be the enemy. Shots were fired, but in the distance. "Quicken the throat," came the command, and Rostov felt his little Rook kick up his rump, switching to a canter. He guessed his movements ahead of time, and felt merrier and merrier. He noticed a solitary tree ahead. This tree was first ahead of him, in the middle of the line that seemed so terrible. But then they crossed that line, and not only was there nothing frightening, but everything became merrier and livelier. "Oh, how I'm going to slash at him," thought Rostov, gripping the hilt of his saber. "Hurrah!" voices droned. "Well, now let anybody at all come along," thought Rostov, spurring Little Rook and outstripping the others, suddenly sending him into a full gallop. The enemy could already be seen ahead. Suddenly something lashed at the squadron as if with a broad besom. Besom? Rostov raised his sword, preparing to strike, but just then the soldier Nikitenko galloped past, leaving him behind, and Rostov felt, as in a dream, that he was still racing on with unusual speed, and at the same time was staying in place. The familiar hussar, Bondarchuk, galloped towards him from behind and looked at him angrily. Bondarchuk's horse shied, and he swerved around him. "What is it? I'm not moving ahead. I've fallen. I've been killed," Rostov asked, and answered in the same instant. He was alone now in the middle of the field. Instead of moving horses and hussar backs, He saw the immobile earth and stubble around him. There was warm blood under him. No, I'm wounded, and my horse has been killed. Little Rook tried to get up on his forelegs, but fell back, pinning his rider's leg. Blood flowed from the horse's head. The horse thrashed and could not get up. Rostov went to get up and also fell. His pouch caught on the saddle. Where ours were, where the French were, he did not know. There was no one around. Having freed his leg, he got up. Where, on which side now, was that line which he felt so sharply separated the two armies, he asked himself, and could not answer. Has something bad happened to me? There are such cases, and what must be done in such cases? He asked himself, standing up. Just then he felt something superfluous was hanging from his numb left arm. His hand was like someone else's. He examined the hand, vaguely looking for blood on it. Well, here are some people, he thought joyfully, seeing several men running towards him. They'll help me. In front of these people ran one in a strange shako and a blue greatcoat, dark, tanned, with a hook nose. Two more, and then many more, came running behind him. One of them said something strange, non-Russian. Among the men in the back, wearing the same shakos, stood a Russian hussar. He was being held by the arms. Behind him, they were holding his horse. He must be one of ours, taken prisoner. Yes, can it be they'll take me too? What men are these? Rostov kept thinking, not believing his eyes. Can they be Frenchmen? He looked at the approaching Frenchmen, and though a moment before he had been galloping only in order to meet these Frenchmen and cut them to pieces, their closeness now seemed so terrible to him that he could not believe his eyes. Who are they? Why are they running? Can it be they're running to me? Can it be? And why? To kill me? Me, whom everybody loves so? He remembered his mother's love for him, his family, his friends, and the enemy's intention to kill him seemed impossible. But maybe even to kill me. He stood for more than 10 seconds without moving from the spot or understanding his situation. The first Frenchman with the hooked nose came so close that the expression on his face could already be seen, and the flushed alien physiognomy of the man, with lowered bayonet, holding his breath, was running lightly towards him, frightened Rostov. He seized his pistol, and instead of firing it, threw it at the Frenchman, and ran for the bushes as fast as he could. He ran not with the feeling of doubt and conflict with which he had gone to the Enns Bridge, but the feeling of a hare escaping from hounds. One undivided feeling of fear for his young, happy life possessed his entire being. Quickly leaping over the hedges with that swiftness with which he had run playing tag, he flew across the field, turning his pale, kind young face back from time to time, and a chill of terror ran down his spine. No, it's better not to look back, he thought. But running up to the bushes, he turned once more. The Frenchman lagged behind, and even as he looked back, the front one had just changed his trot to a walk, and turning around, shouted something loudly to his comrade behind him. Rostov stopped. Something must be wrong, he thought. It's impossible that they should want to kill me. And meanwhile, his left arm was as heavy as though a 20-pound weight was hanging from it. He could not run any further. The Frenchman also stopped and took aim. Rostov closed his eyes and crouched down. 1, 2 bullets flew whistling past him. He gathered his last strength, held on to his left arm with his right hand, and ran to the bushes. In the bushes, there were Russian riflemen. Section 20. The infantry regiments, caught unawares in the woods, ran out of the woods, and companies, mixing with other companies, retreated in disordered crowds. One soldier uttered in fear of the words, "Cut off!" Senseless and terrible in a time of war, and the words, together with the fear, communicated themselves to the whole mass. "We're surrounded! Cut off! Lost!" cried the voices of running men. The regimental commander, the moment he heard the shouting and cries behind him, knew that something terrible had happened to his regiment, and the thought that he, an exemplary officer with many years of service, to blame for nothing, might be blamed before his superiors for negligence or inefficiency, struck him so much that at the same moment, forgetting both the disobedient cavalry colonel and his own dignity as a general, and above all, totally forgetting danger and the sense of self-preservation, gripped the pommel, spurred his horse, and galloped off to his regiment under a hail of bullets that poured down on, but luckily missed him. He wanted one thing, to find out what was going on, and help to rectify at all costs any error, if there was one, on his part, that he, an exemplary officer with 22 years of service, and never reprimanded for anything, would not be blamed for it. Having galloped luckily through the French, he came to the field beyond the woods, through which our men were running, and, disobeying commands, heading down the hill. That moment of moral hesitation came which decides the fate of battles. Would these disorderly crowds of soldiers heed the voice of their commander, or look at him and go on running? Despite the desperate shouts of the regimental commander, formerly so terrible for the soldiers, despite the furious crimson face of the regimental commander, who no longer resembled himself, and the waving of his sword, the soldiers went on running, talking, firing into the air, and not listening to his commands. The moral hesitation that decides the fate of battles was obviously being resolved in favor of fear. The general began to choke from shouting and powder smoke, and stopped in despair. All seemed lost, but at that moment the French, who had been advancing upon our men, suddenly, for no visible reason, ran back, disappeared from the edge of the woods, and in the woods Russian riflemen appeared. This was Timokhin's company, which alone had kept its order in the woods, and having hidden in a ditch nearby, had unexpectedly attacked the French. Timokhin had fallen upon the French with such a desperate cry and such insane and drunken determination, running at the enemy with nothing but a little sword, that the French, having no time to recover, threw down their arms and fled. Dolokhov, who was running beside Timokhin, killed one Frenchman point blank, and was the first to take a surrendering officer by the collar. The fleeing men returned. The battalions formed up, and the French, who had divided the troops of the left flank in two, were momentarily pressed back. The reserve units had time to join in, and the fleeing soldiers stopped. The regimental commander was standing by the bridge with Major Enkonomov, letting the retreating companies pass by him, when a soldier came up to him, took hold of his stirrup, and almost leaned against him. The soldier was wearing a great coat of bluish factory broadcloth. He had no pack or shako. His head was bandaged, and there was a French ammunition pouch slung over his shoulder. In his hand he was holding an officer's sword. The soldier was pale. In his blue eyes looked insolently into the regimental commander's face. His mouth smiled. Though the regimental commander was busy giving orders to Major Enkonomov, he could not help paying attention to this soldier. "Your Excellency, here are 2 trophies," said Dolokhov, pointing to the French sword in the pouch. "I captured an officer. I stopped the company." Dolokhov was breathing heavily from fatigue. He spoke with pauses. "The whole company can testify. I ask you to remember, Your Excellency." very well," said the regimental commander, and he turned to Major Ekonomov. But Dolokhov did not go away. He untied the handkerchief, pulled it off, and showed the clotted blood on his head. "A bayonet wound. I stayed at the front. Remember, Your Excellency." Tushin's battery was forgotten, and only at the very end of the action did Prince Bagration, still hearing the cannon fire from the center, send the staff officer on duty there, and then Prince Andrei, to order the battery to retreat as quickly as possible. The covering troops stationed near to Tushin's cannon had left on somebody's order in the middle of the action, but the battery went on firing and was not taken by the French, only because the enemy could not suppose that such bold firing was coming from 4 unprotected cannon. On the contrary, from the energetic operation of the battery, they supposed that the main Russian forces were concentrated there in the center, and they tried twice to attack that point, and were driven off both times by the canister fire of the 4 cannons standing solitary on the elevation. Soon after Prince Bagration's departure, Tushin managed to set fire to Schöngraben. "Look, they're scurrying around. It's burning. Look at the smoke. Fine work, Graham. What smoke," said the crews, growing animated. Without any order, all the cannon were turned in the direction of the fire. As if egging it on, the soldiers kept crying at each other, "Fine work! That's the way! Just look! Grand!" The fire, borne by the wind, spread quickly. The French columns that had moved out of the village went back, but as if in punishment for this failure, the enemy set up 10 guns to the right of the village and began firing them at Tushin. Owing to the childlike joy aroused by the fire and the excitement of their successful shooting at the French, our artillerists noticed this battery only when 2 cannonballs and then 4 more landed among the guns, and one brought down 2 horses and another tore the leg off a caisson master. The animation, once established, did not weaken, however, but only changed in mood. The horses were replaced by others from spare carriages. The wounded were removed, and the 4 guns were turned against the 10-cannon battery. An officer, Tushin's comrade, had been killed at the beginning of the action, and in the course of an hour, 17 out of the 40 men of the gun crews had been eliminated. Yet the artillerists were still just as merry and animated. Twice they noticed that the French had appeared below, close to them, and then they fired on them with canister shot. The small man, with weak, animated movements, constantly asked his orderly to give him another little pipe full of that, as he put it, and spilling fire from it, ran forward and looked at the French from under his small hand. "Smack 'em, lads," he kept saying, and would seize the guns by the wheel and unscrew the screws himself. Amidst the smoke, deafened by the ceaseless firing, which made him jump each time, Tushin, without relinquishing his nose-warmer, ran from one gun to the other, now taking aim, now counting the charges, now ordering the dead and wounded horses to be changed and reharnessed, shouting all the while in his weak, high, irresolute voice. His face was growing more and more animated. Only when people were killed or wounded, he winced, and turning away from the dead men, which shouted angrily at his crew, who, as always, were slow to pick up a wounded man or a body. His soldiers, for the most part, fine, handsome fellows, 2 heads taller and twice as broad as their officer, as always in a battery company, all looked to their commander like children in a difficult situation, and the expression on his face was inevitably mirrored on theirs. As a result of the dreadful rumbling, the noise, the necessity for attention and activity, Tushin did not experience the slightest unpleasant feeling of fear, and the thought that he could be killed or painfully wounded did not occur to him. On the contrary, he felt ever merrier and merrier. It seemed to him that the movement when he saw the enemy and fired the first shot was already very long ago, perhaps maybe even yesterday, and that the spot on the field where he stood was a long familiar and dear place to him. Though he remembered everything, considered everything, did everything the best officer could do in his position, he was in a state similar to feverish delirium or to that of a drunken man. And from the deafening sound of his guns on all sides, from the whistling and thud of the enemy's shells, from the sight of the sweaty, flushed crews hustling about the guns, from the sight of the blood of men and horses, from the sight of little puffs of smoke on the enemy's side, after each of which a cannonball came flying and hit the ground, a man, a cannon, or a horse. Owing to the sight of all these things, there was established in his head a fantastic world of his own, which made up his pleasure at that moment. In his imagination, the enemy's cannon were not cannon, but pipes, from which an invisible smoker released an occasional puff of smoke. "Look, he's puffing away again," Tushin said to himself in a whisper, as a puff of smoke leaped from the hillside and was borne leftwards in a strip by the wind. "Now wait for the ball and set it back." "What orders, Your Honor?" said the fireworker, who was standing close to him and heard him mutter something. "Nothing, a shell," he replied. "Now for our Matvevna," he said to himself. In his imagination, Matvevna was the big cannon at the end, of ancient casting. The French looked like ants around their guns. A handsome man and a drunkard, the number 1 at the second gun, was known in his world as Uncle. Tushin looked at him more often than at the others and rejoiced at his every movement. The sound of a musket fire at the bottom of the hill, now dying down, now intensifying again, seemed to him like someone's breathing. He listened to the fading and flaring up of these sounds. "Ha! Breathing again, breathing," he said to himself. He pictured himself as of enormous size, a mighty man, flinging cannonballs at the French with both hands. "Well, Matvevna, old girl, don't let us down," he said, moving away from the gun when a strange, unfamiliar voice rang out over his head. "Captain Tushin! Captain!" Tushin turned around, frightened. It was the same staff officer who had driven him out of Grunt. He was shouting at him in a breathless manner. "What? Have you lost your mind? You've been ordered twice to retreat, but you—" "Well, what are they getting at me for?" Tushin thought to himself, looking fearfully at his superior. Nothing," he said, putting 2 fingers to his visor. But the colonel did not finish everything he wanted to say. A cannonball flew close to him and made him duck and crouch down on his horse. He fell silent and was about to say something more when another cannonball stopped him. He turned his horse and galloped away. "Retreat! Everybody retreat!" he called from the distance. The soldiers laughed. A moment later, an adjutant arrived with the same order. This was Prince Andrei. The first thing he saw on riding out into the space occupied by Tushin's cannon was an unharnessed horse with a shattered leg that was whinnying near the harnessed horses. Blood was pouring from its leg as from a spout. Among the limbers, several men lay dead. One cannonball after another flew over him as he rode on, and he felt a nervous shiver run down his spine. But the thought alone that he was afraid picked him up again. I can't be afraid, he thought, and slowly dismounted among the cannon. He delivered the order and did not leave the battlefield. He decided that the guns would leave the position and be taken away in his presence. Together with Tushin, stepping over the bodies and under the dreadful fire of the French, he got busy with removing the guns. Another superior just came, and he's turned tail quickly, the fireworker said to Prince Andrei. Not like your honor. Prince Andrei said nothing to Tushin. The two men were so busy that they seemed not to even see each other. Having limbered up the two remaining guns of the four, one smashed cannon and a unicorn were abandoned, Prince Andrei rode up to Tushin. Well, goodbye, said Prince Andrei, offering his hand to Tushin. Goodbye, dear heart, said Tushin. You good soul, goodbye, dear heart, Tushin said with tears, which for some reason suddenly came to his eyes. And that's where we'll stop for today. Interesting. Rather exciting. I like how he keeps jumping between the different characters that he's already introduced, like Dolokhov, who's this enlisted soldier who's doing it for the fame and the fortune, obviously. Rostov, who's like 16, 17-year-old boy, but somehow, riding a horse into battle and, the weird, like, how could they want to fire at me? He's such a likable guy, likable young man, and the confusion of that. And then Prince Andrei, who's like, this is my duty, this is my honor. And I like Tushin a lot too, the artillerist. He seems pretty cool. And there's the colonel and the general who are like having a cockfight between themselves about who's in charge. Meanwhile, almost getting everybody killed. Oh, ain't that the truth? I love how he just drops some kind of like little pearls of wisdom in the midst of this, between the dialogue and things happening. And there was something else I wanted to mention from last time, but I don't know that I remember anymore. Well, I hope you all enjoyed that. It was a bit of an exciting sort of chapter, and I'm sure it looks like we will pick up tomorrow with more of the battle. Oh, and I think tomorrow will get us into part 3 of volume 1. So that's exciting. We're making progress, people. We might be done sometime before the end of the year. Well, I hope you guys have a great rest of your day. Feel free to like, comment, give me any questions, and hopefully I'll see you all tomorrow. Thanks so much. Have a great rest of your Tuesday.